Every time someone opens a bottle of medicine now, there is a small ritual that usually goes unnoticed. The plastic band breaks. The cap turns. Under it is another barrier, a foil seal tight across the mouth of the bottle. Most people press a thumbnail under the edge, peel it back, and never think about why it is there. They may be annoyed by it. They may tear it badly, leave a rim of foil stuck to the plastic, shake out 2 tablets, and move on with the day. That thin seal is not just packaging, it is a memory. It is what America built after 7 people in the Chicago area died from a product they had every reason to trust. The killer did not leave a conventional scene. There was no single room to close, no single weapon found beside a body, no suspect standing over a victim, no private argument that explained the first police report. The crime moved through store shelves, medicine cabinets, receipts, lot numbers, hospital calls, and the ordinary motion of people trying to treat a headache, a cold, or pain that should have passed. In 1982, that seal was not there. A bottle could sit on a pharmacy shelf looking harmless. A consumer could pick it up, pay for it, take it home, and place it in a cabinet without seeing anything that warned them the bottle had been opened before. The vulnerability was physical, almost embarrassingly simple. A capsule could be pulled apart, filled with poison, closed again, and returned to a bottle that still looked ordinary from the outside. The Chicago Tylenol murders begin with that ordinary look. Late September in the Chicago area does not sound like the beginning of a national panic. It sounds like school mornings, work commutes, grocery errands, drugstore receipts, suburban kitchens, and television sets still carrying the habits of a country that trusted the products it bought. Extra-Strength Tylenol was not obscure. It was a household name, the kind of medicine people kept near cough syrup, bandages, aspirin, and thermometers. The first death was Mary Kellerman, 12 years old, in Elk Grove Village. She was given extra-strength Tylenol after feeling ill. The fact is simple, and that is what makes it hard to sit with. A child was given medicine by parents who believed the bottle contained medicine. There was no reason for them to think the ordinary act had become dangerous. At first, the case could have looked like a sudden medical tragedy. Emergency rooms see collapses that arrive before anyone understands them. Doctors and paramedics begin with the body in front of them, the symptoms they can measure, and the few minutes they have to act. Nobody looking at one patient automatically sees a consumer product attack spreading across a region. Mary's death carried a terrible problem for the first responders. The bottle had done what it was supposed to do in every visible way. It sat in a home as a trusted household item. It did not arrive with a warning note. It did not look like evidence to anyone outside the sudden medical emergency. That is why the earliest minutes of the case were so dangerous. If each death stayed inside its own medical explanation, the product link could remain invisible long enough for more people to take capsules from other bottles. The first case did not yet give investigators a map. It gave them a child, a medicine bottle, and a cause that was not yet obvious enough to warn a region. The map only began to appear after other homes produced the same impossible pattern. Then the deaths multiplied. On September 29, Adam Janus died after taking Tylenol. His brother Stanley and Stanley's wife, Teresa, came to the home in grief, and they too took capsules from the same bottle. They also died. The Janus cluster changed the room because it placed the answer closer to the medicine cabinet. One person dying after taking a common medication could be misread as coincidence. 3 people connected to one bottle made coincidence start to collapse. The useful clue in the Janus home was not dramatic. It was the bottle and the receipt. Helen Jensen, a nurse and public health worker in Arlington Heights, did the kind of work that can look small until a whole case turns on it. She was not looking at a villain. She was looking at a medicine bottle still. Inside a grieving house, a sales receipt that put the bottle in time and place, and a count of capsules that did not sit right. The bottle was still looked ordinary, and that was the useful, frightening fact. It suggested that the danger had not only entered the house, it had arrived wearing the shape of a trusted product. The bottle became a root. The Janus home gave the investigation a shape that a hospital chart could not. It showed how one contaminated bottle could keep acting after the first death, moving from one grieving person to another inside the same house. That detail was not graphic, but it was devastating as evidence. The bottle did not stop being dangerous because the first person had already collapsed. It sat there, ordinary and available, until someone noticed the pattern. The receipt was the piece that gave the bottle a past. It could put a purchase in time and place. It could tell investigators which store had sold that container, when it had been sold, and whether the bottle might connect to others. In a different murder case, detectives might search for a car leaving a scene. Here they had to search for a product moving through retail. A receipt is a thin thing, easy to lose, but inside this case, it gave investigators a path from a family home back to a store. The capsule count gave them another measure. The bottle was not merely a container. It was a piece of the crime scene, and the scene now extended from a shelf to a counter, to a household, and into a medical examiner's work. The next move was chemistry. The capsules went from homes and hospitals into the hands of people who could test what the eye could not see. A capsule still looked like medicine until the powder inside it was treated as evidence. Cyanide entered the file as a lab result, not a rumor. Once the tests confirmed that Tylenol capsules had been contaminated, the investigation left the narrow space of individual medical emergencies and moved onto every store shelf that might hold the same product. That discovery changed every shelf in Chicago. The lab work had its own quiet texture. Capsules opened on a bench, powder separated from expectation. Tests that did not care how famous the brand name was. The poison did not belong in a pain reliever. Once cyanide was confirmed, the investigation no longer had the luxury of treating the deaths as a local mystery. A medicine bottle in one suburb had become a warning for every cabinet within reach of the same product. The investigators also had to ask how many bad capsules were inside a bad bottle. A contaminated container could include poisoned and unpoisoned capsules together, which meant danger was uneven inside the same package. That made public warning harder. A person could take one capsule and live. Another could take a different capsule from the same bottle and die. The randomness was part of the terror. The killer had found a way to make the public do the final movement for him. He did not need to know each victim. He did not need to be present when the capsule was swallowed. He only needed a bottle to appear normal long enough for someone to buy it. The distance between killer and victim was no longer a street or a house. It was a supply chain. Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner were pulled into the same file as Mary Kellerman and the three members of the Janus family. Not because their lives had crossed in any ordinary way, but because the same trusted product had become dangerous in different homes. By the time investigators counted 7 victims, the link was no longer a person who knew them. It was a bottle shape, a capsule form, and a decision made by someone who did not need to know the names of the people who would die. That was the coldest part of the case for investigators. The victim pool was not chosen in the usual way. It was created by chance, after the bottles returned to public circulation. The killer may have selected stores, routes, or shelves. The victims selected nothing except a product millions of people already used. The victims' different lives gave investigators almost nothing in common beyond the bottle. That absence of connection mattered. In many murder files, the first practical question is who knew the victim. Here, the answer did not narrow the field. A child in Elk Grove Village, members of a family in Arlington Heights, adults in other Chicago area homes. Their connection was not social. It was retail. Paula Prince's case also left one of the most haunting public images connected to the investigation. A store surveillance photograph from a Walgreens. It was useful not because it solved the crime, but because it showed the kind of place the killer had used. A shopper, a shelf, a drugstore camera, a bottle that looked safe until it was not. The image turned the consumer aisle into an investigative space. The retail map began to matter. Investigators had to find where the poisoned bottles had been purchased, which stores carried them, whether the bottles came from the same lot, whether the tampering could have happened at a factory, warehouse, delivery point, or after the bottles reached stores. Each answer opened or closed a different kind of case. If the poison entered during manufacturing, the suspect pool and product risk would look one way. If someone tampered with bottles after they reached local shelves, the map became smaller and more human. The lot numbers were supposed to help. Lot numbers give investigators order: factory, batch, route, distribution. But this case resisted easy order. Tainted bottles appeared across the Chicago area, and evidence suggested they had not all passed through one single manufacturing path that could explain the poison at the source. That pushed the working theory toward local retail tampering. Someone may have bought or taken bottles, opened capsules, added cyanide, returned the bottles to shelves, and let ordinary customers complete the crime without knowing it. That theory had power because it fit the geography. It also had a weakness that never went away. It required investigators to find a person inside the ordinary movement of stores. Manufacturing plants and delivery routes gave investigators records to examine, but the store shelf introduced a messier world. Employees stocking products, customers picking up bottles and putting them back, parking lots turning over all day, and cash purchases that left little more than a receipt if anyone kept it. In 1982, investigators did not have modern camera networks, debit card trails for every purchase, or cell phone location history to rebuild who had stood in an aisle and touched a package. The killer had used retail normality as cover. The stores gave the case its geography: Jewel, Osco, Walgreens, Dominic's, local grocery and drugstore shelves across the Chicago area. The store aisles forced detectives to think less like scene technicians and more like shoppers retracing a route. Where could someone stand without being remembered? How long would it take to remove bottles, tamper with capsules, and return them? Could one person do it? Could the route be tested against work hours, car travel, or known addresses? The old retail world protected the killer by being normal. There was nothing suspicious about someone touching medicine on a shelf. There was nothing unusual about a bottle leaving a store and another bottle being returned. Without a broken seal to betray the act, the crime could hide inside the most ordinary consumer behavior. Police, medical examiners, poison control workers, store managers, corporate officials, and reporters all moved at once. Warnings went out not to take Tylenol. Shelves were cleared. Bottles were collected. Telephones rang in newsrooms and police stations. Parents looked inside medicine cabinets and saw danger in something they had bought to make illness easier. A recall began with one lot, then widened. Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiary, McNeil eventually pulled enormous quantities of Tylenol from the market. The number that stayed with the country was about 31 million bottles. That figure matters not because it is large, but because it shows how far a single unsolved act could reach. The killer touched a few bottles. The response had to treat millions as suspect. The recall became the part of the story business schools would later study. Inside the murder file, it had a different function. It was a public safety move and an evidence problem at the same time. Every returned bottle might be harmless. Every returned bottle might be the next clue. A bottle on a shelf could no longer be only inventory. It had to be handled as potential evidence. On the ground, a recall is not an abstract corporate decision. It is clerks pulling bottles from shelves, police and health workers, handling returned products, warehouse space filling with containers that all look alike until someone checks the lot, the label, the contents, and the route. A returned bottle could be evidence, or it could be one more harmless object in a flood of harmless objects. Investigators had to live with that uncertainty, while the public needed a clear instruction immediately. The recall also created a second geography. The first map was where people had died. The second map was where the product had gone. Those maps overlapped, but they were not the same. The killer's actual path could be hidden inside the space between them. The television warnings moved faster than the proof. That was necessary and dangerous. Necessary, because waiting for perfect certainty could leave more people dead. Dangerous, because panic creates its own evidence stream. Phone calls pour in. People remember suspicious shoppers. Someone recalls a stranger near a shelf. Another person thinks a bottle looked wrong after seeing a news report. Police have to hear all of it without letting fear become fact. Inside the command rooms, information did not arrive in neat categories. A lab result confirmed cyanide. A receipt pointed to a store. A lot number gave a manufacturing clue that still did not explain who had opened a bottle after it reached the public. At the same time, tips began to carry the shape of the news itself. Once people knew Tylenol was involved, every recent drugstore aisle could become a memory, and every memory had to be checked before it could become evidence. The evidence in this case hid inside ordinary objects. A capsule looked like a capsule, a bottle looked like a bottle. The dangerous material was inside chemistry, packaging, receipt paper, and the path of sale. Someone could stand in front of a shelf, see nothing wrong, pay at a register, and take the bottle home without realizing that every step had become part of a murder investigation. Investigators searched for the person who had entered that chain. The store map became one of the case's central documents. Retail names, purchase dates, lot numbers, toxicology results, and family statements had to be placed beside one another, until the geography began to show what the deaths alone. Every store had to be treated as a possible scene, even though the aisles had no broken lock, no alarm, and no visible mark that said a bottle had once been removed, opened, altered, and returned. The killer's method also created a strange uncertainty about intent. Did he choose the stores because they were close to home? Because they were easy to enter and leave? Because they gave him a route across suburbs? Because he wanted random victims? Because he wanted a corporate target? Because he wanted panic itself? The evidence could show what happened. Motive remained thinner. Then came the extortion letter. It did not sound like an ordinary crank note. The writer claimed it was easy to place cyanide into capsules, then turned that claim into a demand. If you want to stop the killing, wire $1 million. The letter was handled as threat, possible evidence, and extortion at the same time. Johnson & Johnson took it seriously enough to prepare for the possibility of payment, while the FBI instructed the company not to wire the money. James W. East sent that letter. It placed him inside the investigation, but not as a convicted murderer. He was arrested, prosecuted for extortion, and sentenced to prison. He admitted writing the letter, but denied poisoning the capsules. The distinction has to stay clear, because the legal record never crossed from extortion conviction into murder conviction. Lewis was difficult for investigators to ignore. He gave authorities a scenario for how someone could have carried out the tampering. He had a complicated history. He used aliases. He had legal trouble before and after the Tylenol investigation. Reporting over the years kept returning to him because he seemed too close to the case to dismiss cleanly and too far from proof to convict for murder. That is the worst kind of suspect folder. Heavy enough to remain on the table, not strong enough to close. The timing of his letter made the suspicion sharper. If parts of his account were true, investigators had to ask how much he knew before the public knew it. If his account shifted, they had to ask why. But none of that solved the physical problem. A murder charge needs more than a disturbing letter and a clever explanation. It needs evidence that can place the person into the act, the bottles, the poison, or the root. The letter also created a timing problem. If Lewis had written when he said he wrote, investigators had to compare that claim against when the public first learned enough about the poisonings. A letter postmark, a news cycle, and a suspect's explanation became part of the same calculation. This is the kind of detail that sounds small until it forces a suspect folder to stay open. Lewis complicated the file in another way. He seemed capable of imagining the method. He described how someone could buy bottles, poison capsules, and put them back into retail circulation. That explanation looked close to the working theory. It also remained an explanation rather than a physical link to the contaminated bottles. A person can describe a crime without proving he committed it. Lewis remained the name that followed the case for decades. When he died in 2023, many headlines called him the suspect. That was fair as far as it went, but not the same as a verdict. His death closed one living line of questioning. It did not close the murders. The case could no longer ask him new questions, and the families could no longer hear a courtroom answer from him. What remained was the same old split. Suspicion on one side, proof on the other. There were other leads. Roger Arnold drew attention because of Stateman's behavior and a reported possession of cyanide-related knowledge. His name entered the investigative orbit. He was never charged in the Tylenol murders. Later, in a separate tragedy, he shot and killed an innocent man he had mistaken for someone else connected to suspicion around him. That shooting showed how public accusation and paranoia can create damage around a case, even when the murder file itself remains unsolved. The Tylenol case did not merely produce victims. It produced an atmosphere in which suspicion became dangerous. Police also chased tips, rechecked evidence, took DNA samples years later, and looked again when forensic technology improved. Lewis submitted DNA. Arnold's remains were exhumed for testing. The results did not give the clean answer the case needed. New tools can reopen an old file, but they cannot create evidence that was never preserved or connect a person to a bottle, if the biological trace does not hold. That is one reason the case remains open in the public mind, even when the historical facts are familiar. The story has all the pieces that make people expect a solution. 7 victims, a specific product, contaminated capsules, a small geography, a major recall, an extortion letter, a primary suspect, and decades of forensic review. Yet the point of tampering remains out of reach. The later evidence reviews show the frustration of a case caught between eras. Investigators could return to old bottles, old fingerprints, old items, and old suspect names with better tools. They could ask whether DNA or other traces might now say what they had not been able to say in 1982. But a better tool still needs something useful to read. If a bottle had been touched by too many people, stored through too many years, or preserved without a trace that pointed to the killer. Modern technology could only narrow questions, not manufacture an answer. The case also carried a basic chain of custody, pressure. A bottle purchased by a victim, handled by family, responders, police, lab staff, and evidence personnel might still be valuable. It might also be contaminated by the life of the investigation itself. Every old trace had to be interpreted with that history in mind. The missing piece is not the poison, it is the hand. Investigators know the delivery mechanism, they know the product, they know the deaths, they know the response. They know the vulnerability in capsule packaging. They know the likely logic of returning bottles to shelves. What they have not proven in court is the person who did it. The scale of public reaction was immediate because the crime attacked routine. People did not simply avoid one store. They questioned medicine itself. Parents checked cabinets. Pharmacies removed bottles. Police and health officials told the public not to consume Tylenol products. News reports carried the warning from Chicago into the rest of the country. The fear traveled faster than the killer ever needed to travel. Copycat threats and later tampering cases showed how dangerous the method was once the country understood it. Product tampering had become imaginable. That is part of the damage the killer did. He did not only kill 7 people. He taught the public that a shelf could be used as a crime scene. The law and packaging changed because of that lesson. Tamper-resistant packaging became a new expectation. Bottles gained seals, bans, protective barriers, and warnings that told consumers not to use the product if the package had been opened. The pharmaceutical industry moved away from easy-to-open powder-filled capsules toward forms, harder to contaminate without leaving signs. Congress passed federal anti-tampering law. The medicine cabinet was redesigned by an unsolved murder case. The packaging change had its own physical language. Plastic bands around caps, foil over bottle mouths, warnings printed on labels, later caplets that could not be opened and refilled like powder capsules. Those features are so common now that they almost feel natural. But they were engineered from a failure. The package had to begin telling the consumer if someone had been there first. The fear reached beyond medicine. Parents worried about Halloween candy. Stores faced questions about food and household goods. Other companies examined their own packaging because the Tylenol murders had exposed a wider weakness. A modern consumer society depends on sealed trust. Once that trust is broken, one product is never only one product. That is the case's strangest legacy. Public safety improved, but justice did not arrive. The seal helped protect future consumers. It made the old vulnerability visible. It gave manufacturers, regulators, and families a physical answer to a physical weakness. But it could not travel backward to September 1982. It could not identify the person who opened those capsules. It could not undo the moment when someone reached for a bottle and trusted it. The victims' names remain the center that the packaging story can accidentally push aside. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, Mary Reiner. 7 names, 7 lives, and 1 ordinary product turned into a murder instrument. A corporate case study can talk about recall speed, public messaging, market recovery, and brand survival. The murder file has to stay with the people who died, and with the fact that no one has been convicted for killing them. A case this public can become too clean in hindsight. The country knows the outcome now. Recalls, seals, warning labels, caplets, law, crisis management textbooks. In the first days, no one had that shape. Officials had symptoms, calls, bottles, frightened families, and a spreading realization that every unanswered question could cost another life. That first week is where the real pressure lived. The case moved by hand from one practical act to the next. Helen Jensen protected the Janus bottle and receipt, while toxicologists opened capsules at a lab bench, and medical officials weighed cyanide as the common cause. Police compared deaths across suburbs. Store managers cleared shelves, and reporters repeated urgent warnings. In homes far from the lab, families searched medicine cabinets for a bottle they had trusted the day before. Those actions saved lives and preserved pieces of the path. But they still did not give investigators the hand that had opened the capsules. The suspect theory survived because the answer did not come. James Lewis remained the heaviest name because of the extortion letter, his shifting explanations, his criminal history, and his strange proximity to the logic of the crime. Roger Arnold remained part of the case's darker edges because of suspicion, cyanide talk, and the separate killing that followed. Other theories appeared because an unsolved public crime cannot stay empty for long. A blank space invites names. But a name is not a chain of proof. For a murder charge, investigators would need more than a suspect who looked wrong in the file. They would need a usable connection to cyanide, bottles, shelves, timing, or trace evidence, strong enough to survive cross-examination decades after the first deaths. The proof would have to explain why those stores, those bottles, those lots, and why the trail disappeared after the panic began. The Tylenol murders remain unsolved because the crime was built inside a public retail system that was never designed to preserve a murderer's trail. Bottles passed through stores with too many hands and too little surveillance. The method left chemistry, but no conventional witness. The recall had to move fast enough to protect the public, even while that speed scattered the evidence field across households, stores, police rooms, and company returns. The strongest suspect was tied to extortion, not conclusively to the contaminated capsules, and later forensic work had to depend on traces that may never have been clean enough to begin with. The killer exploited a gap between product trust and product protection. Once that gap was closed, the country became safer. But the closing of the gap also froze the original crime in its own era. The murderer had acted before the seal, before the cameras, before the transaction data, before the modern reflex to treat every broken package as suspicious. When I look at the case now, I do not start with the suspect folder. I start with the bottle. A bottle on a shelf, a receipt in a house, a missing capsule count, a lab test, a map of stores, a recall order, a letter demanding money, a suspect who died without a murder conviction, a seal that appeared later on, millions of bottles that had nothing to do with the original crime and everything to do with its lesson. The thin foil on a modern bottle is a kind of answer, but not the answer the families wanted. It can warn a consumer that a package has been opened. It can force a manufacturer to defend trust before the bottle ever reaches a shelf. What it cannot do is name the person who picked up Tylenol bottles in 1982, opened capsules, added cyanide, and put them back where strangers would carry them home. That question is still under the seal.